Thank you very much. Welcome, all of you, to our second webinar this year, and we appreciate your presence. Before we start, let us pray and that the Lord will guide us and help us. Our gracious Father, thank you for your grace and thank you for the means of internet so that we can connect with people everywhere to address subjects that are sometimes crucial to us. And we pray for a clarity of the speaker and understanding in our mind that will ease that. We pray also that your name and your Son, Jesus Christ, will be glorified by this. And we thank you for this opportunity and this platform that you create for us. And we thank you for the people who are here, who have taken their time and their airtime to be online to listen to this pressing topic. And we give you praise, glory, and honor. Lead us and guide us in Christ we pray. Amen. And once again, thank you very much. My name is Bafana Shabalala, one of the workers of Academy of Theology. For those who first time to come on Academy of Theology, our vision is this, that we are intentionally contextualizing Christianity in African context, meaning that we want to bring the gospel in the context of our people as the Bible is contextual itself. And also, we are founded on this one verse, a few verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 to 23, where Paul said, "For though I be free from all, yet I made myself servant unto all, that I may gain more. Unto the Jews I became a Jew." We take from that verse, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 to 23. That's what we stand with that verse. Today, our webinar is the second one of 2022. But before, if you go to our YouTube page, we have 11 webinars that we did dealing with crucial questions that we always address. The issue of prosperity gospel, deliverance, we've done that. Office of Apostle, doing theology from from Ubuntu perspective, traditional religion, is Christianity a white man? We have done all that, even the writing seminar. There are 11, they are in our page, YouTube, you can go there and like them. Our vision stands like this. We aim at training pastor. Academy of Theologies is an institution that will commence in 2024. Therefore, our aim is to train pastor or aspiring pastors, laymen, through the curriculum that is relevant to African context. Not only that, we want to develop writers who will write in our own context what is happening in Africa and bring the gospel from there, and also help churches to guide them with the gospel on the ground and gospel on the air in what we are doing now. Gospel on the ground, we want to help with crusade. We want to assist where it is difficult, where our people cannot get along and help, so that we can bring that into our township. Academy is more focused on the township and to assist pastors who minister there. Focus also on the rural areas, where how to minister them. We want to help that. We want to encourage that. So even today, our topic, as we have bring it to it, these are topics that are relevant to us, and we want to bring the gospel in that. How can we address those issues that we no longer address? And our theology, when we start our school, it will address such things that are in the Bible, also bring them in the context of our people without any wasting of time because of this topic. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we appreciate your presence. I will hand it over to Sbu and to introduce our speaker today so that we can continue with our topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bafana. Welcome to everybody on this cold Wednesday night. It is truly a privilege for us to be able to do this again, as we are also almost like post-lockdown. But we have gotten so much used to webinars and being online that it's difficult to cut the habit of doing things online. and I think it's going to be part of us for some time. So welcome. Thank you for taking time to join us, whether you're coming from work. I know that tomorrow we're looking forward to a holiday. And so thank you for being with us here tonight. So our topic tonight is the topic of Lobola. Lobola, I don't think it's something that is very foreign to many of us if we are African people living in South Africa, Southern African mostly. It is something that we are going to face. If you're someone who's not married, if you're someone who is going to go into marriage, more than likely, if you are Black and you live in South Africa, 9 out of 10, you will have to go through this process. And so it is a privilege for us as the Academy of Theologians, Bafana has said, we want to be contextual, we want to be helpful, we want to be biblical in whatever that we do, we want to be Christ-centered in everything we do. So we want to find out, what does the Bible have to say regarding this topic? As we know that this is it's not a controversial topic, but it has become controversial, I think, in our generation because of there's so many changes. There's so many things that have not been understood regarding the practice. And so tonight we have Baba Mzondi to come and help us to be able to deal with this topic. Thank you so much to Dr. Mzondi for just being available to be able to help us. Just to let you know that before we just started, he lost electricity. I believe is it Mohlakeng where he is, and so he had to just find a nearby spot outside where he can find electricity. It's very cold where he is. So thank you so much, Dr. Mzondi, for being with us here tonight. Dr. Mzondi has earned 2 doctoral degrees in theology from the University of Johannesburg. He is the founder and director of Back to the Basics, Kaho Liswa, and is also one of the 3 co-founders and pastor of Let My People Go ministry. He's also served as a supervisor at South African Theological Seminary. He has a passion for children, youth, families, and leadership training. His interests are in anything to do with Ubuntu, African theology, African indigenous knowledge systems, African womanism, and Pentecostalism. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure he's also maybe might talk about his family. He's married with children, and then maybe he will also tell us a bit about that. So thank you so much for Dr. Mzondi for joining us. Just a few in-house issues before we start. Please make sure that you are muted as he speaks. And so the format is going to be that he's going to speak to us for the next couple of minutes, maybe half an hour to 40 minutes. And then after that, we're going to interact, and then definitely we are going to take questions. So see this as a lechutla. You know, there's that word of lechutla, where a village comes around a fire or comes around a chief to be able to discuss matters of the community. And so see this as that, as an older man, as our father in the faith, as he comes and sort of like narrates the story of our traditions, one of them called Lobola, and he marinates that with the Bible and marriage and what that means for us. So we're really, really looking forward to that. And so as you do that, please make sure you're muted. And also you can type your questions in the chat box. We definitely will be able to interact and take questions. We'll try and incorporate them together and make sure that we cover all the bases that we need to cover. Dr. Mzondi, if you can switch on, and maybe I'm going to hand over to you at this time. Can you hear me, Dr. Mzondi?
I can hear you. Do you pick me?
Yes, we can pick you. If you can also, one of the things I know as you introduce yourself, one of the things you emphasize is that you are an Ubuntu theologian. That is a very, very strange term for many of us as African people. We are not aware of what that means. So if you can describe that, the way that you do theology is from an Ubuntu perspective. If you can maybe describe that so that we are aware, because a lot of people really think that there's only one way of doing theology, but they're not aware of other ways. So as you are describing yourself, going into your material, please talk a bit about that perspective. Dr. Mzondi.
Thank you. Let me greet everyone who is part of this session. As indicated, my name is Mandisa Mzondi, and I reside in Mhlakeng, which is on the west of Soweto. I am a pastor, and I'm also an academic at the South African Theological Seminary, where I lecture and supervise masters and doctoral students. My interest in theology is influenced by the Ubuntu worldview, and I do my theology from that point or from that perspective. I deliberately chose that path because it enables me to engage with issues that we as Africans are facing here on the continent. And it enables me to do my hermeneutics and exegesis with that worldview. Ubuntu, it's a holistic worldview that does not separate the physical from the metaphysical. Let me give you an example. When you wake up in the morning and you know that there was no rain, and you're quite sure that there was no rain, and you find some water just before, after you open the door of a kitchen or wherever you are. As Africans, we ask different questions. Where does the water come from? Who placed the water here? Does it have any spiritual significance or any spiritual connotation to that? And ultimately what we do, we consult the elderly, we consult the spiritual leaders, we consult indigenous healers, and to find an answer for that kind of a phenomenon. So we do not dichotomize or separate what we experience in life from what we communicate with in terms of our spirituality. So Ubuntu is that holistic. It's unlike the Western worldview where there is a separation between the metaphysical and the physical. Hence, I chose to do my theology from that point of view. So everything that I do and I say in theology has that kind of grounding. Today, as we discuss Lobola, I will be grounding my discussion from that point of view. I look at the issue of Lobola and marriage. Njengomuntu, singabantu, rebathu. So I'm going to provide an Ubuntu perspective. Relebele jakabathu sibheke njengabantu ukuthi lento kuyini, isithinta kanjani ngoba ngesintu khona izinto esizenzayo uma sikhuluma ngomshado noma sikhuluma ngelobola. Ya no kheba gaetsu re le go tsena mo jakabathu re lebella gore ha re bua ka magadi le lenyalo dilo tse re di dira jang di re ama yang. Gape ntse re itse gore re ba latedi ba morena Jesu. So let me begin by saying our culture is oral. And it's different from some cultures which are written. And our spirituality also is transmitted orally from generation to generations. So what we know today mostly has not been written on a piece of paper, but has been transmitted to us through various ways. It could be by music, it could be by idioms, it could be by riddles, it could be by art. And those means and ways have preserved our culture, heritage, and our tradition as Africans. And if you look into that, is a culture, if we go into look into the timeline in the Bible that is provided, which I'm going to use, I'll begin from the time of Noah. If you look into the time of Noah biblically, up until the time of his great-grandsons, Jacob and his brother Esau, you would notice that Noah had 3 sons, and these sons lived in different parts of the world, the then world. So we as Africans are the sons of Cush. And Cush is the son of Ham, and Ham is the son of Noah. So we trace our roots and we trace our originality to Noah and to Shem, much as other nations as well do trace their originality from Noah. The Caucasians who trace to Noah through Japhet, the Indo-Asians who trace their originality through Shem. So we as the people on earth all biblically can trace ourselves from Noah. Now, the sons of Ham occupied what we now call North Africa and South Arabia. The sons of Shem occupied what we call the Middle East and towards the east of India, Europe, and Asia. And these two sons produced or had children, and their children intermarried, and that their children mingled together over many generations. And you see this in the time of Abraham, when Abraham was moving between the now Middle East and Egypt. You see that with his son Isaac, he was also moving that way. You see that with other members of his family who were moving between the Middle East and Africa. So there was a constant movement between these two areas and these two societies. And the other thing that happened among them was there was also intermarriage. So cultures, traditions, and practices between these two nations are very similar. And we are going to notice that as we talk, that one of the similar things that we can identify between the two, if we look into the book of Genesis, is that there was concubinage, where we first see it when Abraham and Sarah could not have a child. And Sarah advised Abraham to sleep with Hagar so that she could produce a child for them. That's concubinage, and that kind of practices is also identifiable south of Sahara. The next practice that you see is the practice of polygamy, where one man would marry many 2 or 3 wives. You see that when Jacob married the 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel. You also see the practice of arranged marriages, where Hagar arranged a marriage for his son Ishmael among his people in Egypt, because Hagar was Egyptian. So she arranged that her son marry an Egyptian woman. The same thing happened with Abraham's son, where his father indicated that he should marry among his relatives, and he married one of her cousins. It happens with Jacob as well. The two sisters that he married were his cousins. So there was that kind of relationship of intermarriage, marrying within the same family or within the same clan, that you find in the two descendants of Shem and the descendants of Ham. So there is a close connection between us as Africans and now specifically the Jews or the Hebrew nation. Some of the practices are very, very common. And the difference is that our practices have been transmitted orally, whilst the Jewish practices have been transmitted in a written form. So if you talk of Lobola, you see Lobola being paid in the case of Abraham's son, when Abraham's servant went to go and look for a wife, and he found Rebecca. And in that case, it was an arranged marriage, which is part of what was happening in Africa in some few years earlier. So arranged marriages were always part of a culture in the descendants of Ham and among the descendants of Shem as well. So in those kind of marriages, when they were arranged, bridal price was paid, which is what we call Lobola in our Nguni language, or Mahadi in our Sesotho language. So you see the servant of Abraham presenting so many things to the father of Rebecca. You see that also happening when Jacob was working to marry Rachel, and he was cheated, and Rachel's father presented Leah instead of Rachel. He worked 7 years for Rachel and worked 7 years for Leah. So that's a kind of payment of price that he paid to get married. And you see this practice continuing within the Jewish or the Hebrew nation. So the whole thing of Lobola or Mahadi, it's a common practice that you find among Africans and Hebrews and Jews then. So what happens when we come to the time of the New Testament is that the New Testament produced Christians or followers who are following Christ and are from different nationalities, including the Jews. And among them, there are those of us who are Africans who are practicing the tradition of Lobola, and others enter into marriage through some kind of different practices. And all these people who are following Christ would enter into a marriage based on what their tradition or culture is saying. Up until today, when we enter into a marriage relationship, we enter into a marriage relationship based on what our culture is saying or what our tradition is saying, be it oral or written. Now, the question that we're trying to answer today is, when is a person married before the eyes of God? Before you paid Lobola or after you paid Lobola, whether half or full? So my view is that we have to be careful. The issue of Lobola is culture relative within us Africans. If you look among the Tswana speaking, the Sotho speaking, they will do different. Though there are similarities, but they will do differently. If you look among the Nguni speaking, they will do it differently. But the bottom line is that Lobola is paid as a way of appreciation. That's the most important thing. It was never something that is meant to be a price that you pay parents, but it was a token of appreciation that one would give to the girl's parents. And you see that when we look in the book of Genesis. So that's the most important thing, is a token of appreciation. 2, Lobola shows that as a man, you are already matured to handle life and to enter into marriage. So it's a sign of testing your maturity and responsibility as a man. 3, the payment of Lobola also enables a marriage covenant to be entered between the wife and the woman. And you would notice that in the Old Testament practices where I've mentioned, marriage is seen as a covenant. And as you look into what Paul is teaching in the New Testament, he is teaching that marriage is a covenant. So the issue of Lobola helps the two families to enter into a covenant which is not broken. And if we look into the Christian perspective, the same thing is happening. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul says, no one should leave marriage. If you look into the issue of John in Matthew 18, where the Jews were asking Jesus about marriage, Jesus said, marriage should not be broken. If you look into the Mosaic, the Torah, where it talks about marriage was never intended to be broken. So it's a covenant that is entered between two people. It is not a legal contract, it's a covenant. So there's a difference between a legal contract and a covenant. So if you look into the issue of Lobola within our context as Africans or as Abantu, we see it as a covenant between not only the two people who are marrying, but the two families. Hence, in the process of Lobola, there is what we call Tlhabela Mahadi, and there's what we call providing certain gifts to the parents of the woman or the wife and vice versa. So all these things encapsulate or promote the issue of cementing a covenant that does not only end up with the two who are getting married, but it also includes the two families. And the underlying factor is that this is an a covenant that is not expected to be broken. So as an oral culture, we spill blood to enter into a covenant as a sign. And in other nations or in other communities, they use a ring as a sign of blood covenant. But before the usage of a ring, it was a blood covenant. So blood covenants were entered before rings were manufactured or designed by human beings. So the issue of lobola also leads into a blood covenant between the two families and those who are getting married. So to answer that, when is marriage before the eyes of God? Within the African context, we need to separate the three. In the South African context, there is what we call the marriage according to the Marriage Act of 1965. 2, after the new democratic government, there is what we call a marriage according to the Customary Marriage Act. So these are the two marriage acts that are available or actually promulgated in our country. It's either you marry through the Marriage Act of 1965 or you marry according to Customary Marriage Act. And prior to the new dispensation, anyone who married outside the 1965 Marriage Act was not considered as marriage, because it was not registered to the Department of then Home Affairs. So then the critical question that nuances this is that, are you married because you went to the Home Affairs and signed the legal documents? Are you married, or when you paid a portion of your lobola?
Muruti,
so this is where we will be navigating ourselves.
Sorry to disturb you. I think Anankomo, you're not aware, your camera is on and we just don't want, we are seeing something on the camera. Me Anankomo, please switch off your camera. Me Anankomo, switch off your camera. Sorry, Mfundis, correct.
So our great-grandparents, before the advent of Christianity here in South Africa, entered into a marriage covenant outside of the Marriage Act of 1965. And traditionally, once you have paid lobola partially or wholly, then you are considered married. And it will differ from community or society to society. Other societies would actually say to you, once you pay partial part of your lobola, then they would hand you the bride. Others would say you have to wait up until the whole process is completed. So it will differ from community to community. Now, with the advent of the colonizers who brought in a marriage act that says you are only married when you sign a marriage contract, then we are pulled into two directions. That you marry in terms of culture, which is now accepted in the Customary Marriage Act, and you also marry again in terms of the Marriage Act of 1965. And here we are talking marriage of a heterosexual marriage, not a homosexual marriage. I am deliberately excluding that because a homosexual marriage or a marriage between men and men and women and women, it's not considered marriage. It's called a union. Hence, it's called the Civil Union Act. But the marriage in this country is considered when you marry in terms of the 1965 Marriage Act or the Customary Marriage Act. The other is not a marriage, it's legally considered as a civil union. So I would request that we do not bring that into the discussion now. Just limit ourselves to the Civil Union Act, the Marriage Act of 1965 and the Customary Marriage Act, which also allows the practice of polygamy in African traditions. So the challenge and the pulling is that as Christians, you marry in three ways. The traditional way, where you pay lobola and all the processes are followed. Secondly, you marry by signing a legal contract or documents provided by the Department of Home Affairs, so that your marriage may be registered in the population register of the country, to show that you are now change your status from being single to being married. And you also marry according to your church tradition, which in different churches, every church would prescribe its own tradition of when do they see you as married. So as Christians, particularly born-again Christians, you marry in two ways. Customary in terms of paying lobola and all the processes, 3 in terms of the Marriage Act, 2 in terms of the Marriage Act, and 3 in terms of what the church is prescribing. So we are faced with these 3 issues. And some would say, if you have not done this one, the Marriage Act, where you sign documentation from the Home Office, then they don't consider you married. Some would say, I don't follow that. I consider myself married if I've only paid lobola. Some would say, even if you've paid lobola, went to sign legal document, when you have not presented yourself in the church to be blessed by the church or the presiding pastor, then you're not married. So these are the 3 tensions that we find ourselves. And I think they will differ from church to church, and they will differ from community to community. Hence, what happens is that on a marriage celebration, people would say, we are doing a white wedding and a traditional wedding, because we want to practice all the 2. The one that is covered by the Customary Marriage Act, and the one that is covered by the 1965 Marriage Act of South Africa. So in that way, you see people embracing the 2 acts, and you see people also going to church, accepting to be blessed and presented before the priest or the pastor. So we engaged, and once all the 3 stages are completed, then people will say, I am now married, and they would consider themselves that they are married in the eyes of God. But this will differ from community to community. In my view, I would say, as Africans, the most important step that we should honor and encourage, and not forced on people, but is the stage of lobola, which is our traditional, our oral tradition and practice, which emphasizes that marriage is a covenant. All right. The Marriage Act of 1965 does not emphasize marriage as a covenant. It emphasizes marriage as a legal contract, which can be dissolved. Hence, there is divorce. The lobola and the African worldview of marriage does not have room for divorce. And it is much more closer to the Judeo-Christian practices of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So my emphasis would be, if one has gone through the stages of paying lobola partially or wholly, as long as the both parents and delegation have agreed that they can allow them to stay together and give them their blessing, then I would argue that they are considered married, and God would consider the marriage because of the issue of the community and the involvement of the parents in the process of making marriage as a covenant. And that view is a view that God is bringing in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The 1965 marriage of having a legal document, other people would see, particularly within the Jewish community now, they do it in 2 ways. That's what they do in terms of culture, some steps, and there's also a legal document that they sign, and there's a ring that you would put on each other's index finger, middle finger. So in that case, within the Jewish community, they would consider you married if you perform the 2 stages. So we are not Jews, we are not Europeans, we are Africans. And I think that's why we need to say we need to respect our oral tradition. Yes, it has got negatives and positives, but its positive is that the process of lobola and payment of lobola emphasizes that you are entering into a marriage covenant, not a legal contract. And in that way, you are much more closer to what God perceives as marriage, instead of emphasizing the Marriage Act of 1965 with its processes of registering your marriage with the Home Affairs, and it allows for the dissolution of marriage. I think I will pack it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Mfundisi. That was concise, and that was to the point, answering the point of discussion for tonight. Again, I just want to urge us, let's switch our cameras off and let us mute ourselves just for the quality of the video, and to also respect the other guests that are with us here today. And also to say that you can start typing your questions. I'll ask Mandisa Mzondi a few questions of my own, but you can start typing, and then we'll be able to put those through to him. So Mfundisi, if you can switch your camera on, we can interact on this one. Njengoba sesishilo ukuthi hayi ngithanda i-background yakho Mfundisi, ngathi sihlele emakhaya kunezinkomo in the background, you know, the community sitting around that. It's a really, really good background. I like your background at the back. Let me ask you this. You said marriage is recognized. You can switch on your camera, Mfundisi. You said marriage is recognized because of community and because of parents. Because the question is, what is marriage according to God's side? And you are citing two stakeholders that are very key in recognizing a marriage to be marriage: the community and the parents. Am I understanding you correctly, sir?
Yes, from an African point of view, the same too. That's why we say to emphasize that you followed all the processes that the community or the clan has prescribed as marriage. And that clan, involves all the two parents in the arrangement and the preparation and the negotiations of Lobola, and that ultimately leads to marriage. So marriage as an institution within our culture is not premised on a legal document. It's premised on the payment of Lobola and following the other processes which ultimately make the two families to enter into a blood covenant and presenting the marriage before the ancestors. I think that's the other aspect that we'll deal with later. So there is a theocratic aspect of marriage in that sense, that we bring in the divine in our marriage, which is different from the legal document that you follow at the Home Affairs. It does not bring in the divine element. It brings in the legal element.
Okay.
So in that way, hence my argument is that we are more closer to God's perspective of marriage as Africans than following the 1965 Marriage Act, which is far from what God perceives as marriage.
Okay, let's go with that as you've put God in. So from an African point of view, then those two are important. Now, when we say, how do we recognize marriage in God's eyes? We obviously, we will know what God has spoken because of his word. And that's where we find out his will and his ways. So from then God's perspective, what verse do we have? A verse, do we have scripture support that will say, if we have taken those two elements of community and parents from African side, we are safe on God's side, from the word side? Do we have any scriptures, or do we have any where to stand on if we take that view?
Remember when Christ was questioned on the issue of divorce, he cited the Old Testament. And
yes,
he brought in the element of a divorce certificate, which the husband would give to a wife. And he said it's because of your hearts are hard. But in the beginning, it was not like that.
okay.
So the issue of bringing in legal documents in marriage is not God's intention. It's man's creation. It's man's development. What God has provided in terms of, if you want to go into a literal understanding of marriage, in Genesis chapter 2, it says, God brought Adam together and he blessed them. So marriage was considered, they were considered married when after God had blessed them. So, and that is much more closer to what we do within the African context, where we consider to one marriage after we have followed a particular process that involves the divine in it, presenting the marriage before the divine.
Okay, let's
If you move into the New Testament, it
yes.
brings in different cultures, and there is Paul bringing in a situation of saying, if you want to get married, get married. If you don't want to get married, you're not doing something wrong. So it's a matter of maintaining your relationship with God and your condition before you got married. But in the Old Testament, it's quite clear. It was an arrangement that was brought before God in terms of divinity.
Yes, you are bringing in what you're calling the divine aspect. And I'll fuse this question here with the question that has come here that talks about a pastor sort of like backing a prayer. So are you saying, when you are saying you are bringing in the divine from African perspective, are you bringing in the divine through, do you define the divine in our context in the sense of ancestors, or then do we define the divine in the sense of bringing in a spiritual person to bless the marriage? Because you're saying we are closer to the biblical worldview in terms of how we do our things as Africans. So when you say the bringing in the divine, and that's the aspect I'm interested in. If you can just double click on what do you mean when you say we are closer to the biblical worldview when we bring in the divine? What constitutes the divine in the African worldview?
As I said earlier, that we do not separate between the metaphysical and the physical in the African worldview or in the Ubuntu worldview.
Yes.
The two are interlinked. So in this case, when we talk about the divine in the Setswana, we talk of Ramasedi. And in the Nguni Sizulu is Umvelingage.
Yes.
So that is the divine that is brought in. And the divine is approached through ancestors. Now, once you become born again, we move from that kind of approach and we move into approach where we approach the divine, which is the biblical God explained in the Judeo-Christian religion through Christ. So a new shift comes into play, that when we follow the process of bringing marriage to the divine, then we follow and we bring in the God of the Bible, Yahweh, and Christ into the marriage relationship or in the marriage process, instead of bringing in the ancestors and presenting that to Yahweh. So we become specific. It is the God of the Bible and Christ. That is the divine that we bring in.
Okay, let's be practical, because I do want to stretch this point a bit. I think it's important. Bringing in Christ and God, uNkulunkulu, as we know him in our worldview. Practically, what does that look like? Njengoba namhlanje, I should speak like today. We see that people get married, like you say. There's a traditional, there's a white wedding. Let's talk about the traditional. Let's just deal with the traditional and the concept of bringing in the divine. How would that look like practically today in terms of bringing in the divine?
It's quite a complex one, because the Lobola process does not involve the bride and the groom. We come in late into the process. We come in early when, as a young man, I would indicate that I want to get married. And from there, the uncles and the others responsible people people in the family take the process ahead, and we come into the process after they've completed everything. And the completion of the Lobola process of Magadi includes go tlhabela Magadi ka Setswana. And the process of go tlhabela Magadi means you bring in 2 sheep as from the boy's family, and the 2 sheep are slaughtered, and after they have been slaughtered, the right side of each sheep are exchanged as a sign of joining the 2 families. And in that process as well, there is a libation that is done. There is also a process of presenting that to the ancestors that the 2 families are now joined together. And that process that does not involve us as the bride and the groom is done by senior people in the 2 families. So we have no control of that.
Right.
So hence within Christian born-again setups, to bring in the divine, which is God of the Bible and Christ, then we would encourage that let this thing become before the pastor or the minister to get a blessing or an unction from that, so that that aspect is manifested.
That's a very, very interesting way of bringing it. So in a way, I guess it would be that people will, and you're welcome. You're welcome to type your questions as you're hearing this. Please feel welcome to type your questions if you want. You have more questions as we are interacting. You're more than welcome. So Mfundisi, what then that you are saying is that the pastor or someone from the church representative in a traditional setting is key because of the issue of them bringing the divine. How would that practically look like? Would that mean somebody they do the Lobola after the celebration? Because correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that even if maybe someone from the church was not around, but because the celebration has been done, that is an adequate sign to say that marriage that is now a marriage. So you are saying it's important to represent the divine as represented by sort of like a pastor, a minister. Maybe just clarify that.
Yes, I think you've got me correct that because we are not part of the process from beginning to end. We only become part of the process when it begins. When as a boy, I need to show that I have enough cow, and where the girl is presented before the two families, so that they identify her. That is the right girl. From there, we are not part of the process. And there are many things that happen in between, which bring in the divine of Ramasedi or Belingange in that process. And most of the time, this is done by people who are not believers like ourselves. Our uncles and aunts are not believers like ourselves. Rarely do we see people who become part of Lobola process and until marriage being born-again parents or born-again relatives. Most of the time they are not. So they will follow the African practices that they know, that which have been passed orally over generations up until they conclude the whole process. So for us who follow Christ and want to bring the divine into the whole aspect, this is where the pastor becomes important. So right. After this whole process, then we request them to say, let this thing be presented to God.
Right. So then,
and we ask God's blessing on this marriage.
Yes. So then if I understand you correctly, then what we consider divine before we got saved, which was the Ukhlabela Abapansi, the ancestors. Now, after we are saved, that aspect is replaced by maybe somebody from the church, a pastor, to be able to maybe help me. How would that look like? Is it blessing the rings, or how would we legitimize from a divine perspective a cultural sort of ceremony?
Let me be practical about this. I'm also a marriage officer.
Yes.
And before I was a marriage officer, I observed getting married in terms of the African perspective processes as indicated.
Yes.
And on the Wednesday of that day, we were taken to a marriage officer who took us through the process of the Marriage Act. On Saturday, we went to church where we were blessed. So I followed 3 steps.
Okay.
And out of that, I decided that it's no longer necessary for these 3 steps. Let's make them 2. So I opted to be a marriage officer. And in our church, what I do is that I am also doing the officiating, which is the legal aspect of the marriage of 1965. And I'm also officiating and blessing the marriage to represent God into and the divine into the marriage. And in that way, I am unctioning and proclaiming blessings in this marriage.
Right.
And also emphasizing the importance of this is a covenant, which is a positive from the previous process.
Right, right. Because
so in other instances,
yes.
Hence, I discourage Christians only ending at the home affairs.
Yes.
Don't end the whole process at the home affairs. Conclude the process at the church, or even if it's not a church building, but with the pastor involved, so that he brings the divine aspect into the marriage.
So Mfundisi, thank you. That is, I think is becoming clear. So if I have to ask this question, then, if it happens that a ceremony is concluded between the 2 families after celebrations have happened without a pastor being involved, what do we say about that? Will that be considered, from a Christian perspective, will that be a legitimate marriage?
Like I was saying, we normally are not part of the process. And the process is led by people who are not born again in terms of our context now. So they would follow all the oral traditions that they know.
Yes.
Including Kastswana, which involves the slaughtering of 2 sheep, like I mentioned, and presenting the couple and the family before Ramasedi through the ancestors. That's the normal process. So and the pastor is not involved in that. I have been involved in the process as a pastor, but not representing a church member, but representing my nieces and nephews. So what I will do in that process, I will not be part of the presentation of the marriage to the ancestors. I'll shift and ask to be excused because I did not submit to that. So if a pastor or a member of a church is part of the process, then there is where you need to communicate with the delegation of both of families that I submit to, this I don't submit to, in an honest and respectful way, without creating tension and conflict in the whole process. Because remember, this is a practice that has been handed already, and people who are not born again or do not emphasize following it step by step as it is.
All right, Swazi, I think that, Swazi, then that answers your question to say, you are saying the family can continue with rituals as they traditionally, then a pastor comes and bless. No, that's not what he's saying. I hope that answers you, Swazi, where he's saying he's not encouraging that Christians do the rituals. He's saying in replacement of what, because in African culture, the divine, that's how they they call the divine, but as you become a Christian, it is represented by a pastor, not necessarily with the traditions being done as to the ancestors, if I'm understanding you correctly, Mfundisi. So just to be super practical, Mfundisi, and then guys, you can type your chats here. I'm bringing them in as a Skuluman Mfundisi. So I'm just trying to find out how then, because obviously there's financial implications. Abantu asinamali wenza ama white wedding, siletha abafundisi, sibhuka ama venue, all of these fancy things. So how do you envision it after the two families have done what they need to do and a pastor is present? Can you just give us some ideas of how that may look like? Does it look like after the ceremony, just having a blessing over them? How will that look like? So that we help those who are saying, I don't have money to do the sort of white traditional thing, but I do want to fulfill the divine aspect of my marriage with the two families. How would that just look like?
Let me show you how I advise our congregants here in our church. The first thing that is important is that marriage is a covenant. And that's where I lay the emphasis. This is a covenant. And I bring in the Judeo-Christian perspective of it. And I also bring the African perspective of Ubuntu in terms of this is also perceived as a covenant. So in that space, we are promoting something that in terms of God's eye is not expected to be dissolved. Second, we differentiate a covenant from a feast. So a wedding is a feast. Marriage is a covenant. And I take a couple through that process of counseling that say, we've got to separate between a marriage feast and a marriage covenant. So you can conclude everything with a marriage covenant and exclude the feast. The feast, unfortunately, is emphasized and promoted more than the covenant. Hence, people would spend so much money and some would even go into debt so that they can hold a feast and impress others. But if we emphasize the covenant aspect of it, then we can end up not being involved in many unnecessary debts after the feast. So if I marry a couple in our church, I would establish their financial strength and find out how they would want to celebrate their marriage after it has been concluded by the Lobola process. And if they would follow a simple example of what is called Poetsatia. Now, Tia is when you go to Home Affairs and come back. It involves very few people. And in that case, then you have reduced a lot of costs. You follow the African traditional way, and you've went to the Home Affairs to register your marriage, then you are done. And people go to Home Affairs with public transport and go back home. They're done.
So Murufi, as you use the phrase, after then they've done the traditional side, then Bayako Home Affairs, yes. And then as they do that is with the pastor. That's how you fulfill the covenant side. Is that what you mean?
Yes. In that case, that's why you bring in the pastor or the religious leader. But the most difficult thing is we want to show off in terms of throwing a big party, and throwing a big party demands a budget. So depending on the two on the couple, as a pastor, we look into will they afford that kind of celebration? If they can't afford a big celebration, then I would promote have a day, or on the day when the conclusion of the marriage of the Lobola process is done, normally we concluded in the morning, and just about 10, 11 o'clock, we officiate a service, and we bless them. That is done without a big celebration. So it depends on how you contextualize that. You can do it on the weekend. You can do it during the week, so that you save costs, unnecessary costs.
Thank you, Mfundisi. Just to also remind you that you can type in your questions, but also just to clarify that we're not necessarily discussing here the relevance of Lobola, whether it's relevant for today. It's not our topic of discussion. We're not discussing the abuses of the practice necessarily. I'm sure Mfundisi might take questions on that, but it's not our primary thing. We're just concerning ourselves as to what constitutes a marriage in God's eyes, and Mfundisi is breaking that down for us here today. Does anyone maybe have a live question that they want to ask before I continue? I don't want to just talk. I think I've covered the questions so far in the chat box. Is there something that's burning that maybe he said, or something that you want clarity from? You can just raise up your hand and I will pick you up, and then you can ask a question. All right. This is Mfundisi, you must be very, very clear. You must have settled all doubts here. Here's a question here. Looking at the economy, should saints opt to leave out Lobola and simply sign at home affairs? Looking at the economy, Nababati Lobola again, I was even talking to a friend of mine, even today, maybe they say that, hey, in our area, Pella, it's between 50 to 70K. If you don't have that, unfortunately, you can't marry. The question comes, should we just leave that, sign at home affairs, and then we are still okay, biblically, we are married? Can that be promoted?
Remember, I indicated that the issue of Lobola and marriage is a community thing. It's not a something that is between two individuals. So it's one of the most difficult things about the process of Lobola, because now Lobola has been commercialized.
Yes.
And before it was commercialized within the Isinguni speaking group, people, a boy would be asked to pay a number of cows for you to be handed the girl. So if you look in terms of how they do it, in terms of the number of cows, I mean, cows then and now are expensive. So the issue of being asked to present so many cows, depending on the type of family where you marry, then becomes problematic in the whole issue. Then once you exclude the family, in that case, then you won't be considered as being properly married by the clan and by the community. And the divine aspect of bringing a blessing and protection and success won't be part of what you have done. So that's why it becomes much more complex. But I've had cases where I would speak to both parties of the couple, and I know of a case where they had agreed that they can get married without Lobola being paid. It would be paid at the time when the boy has sufficient money or cows to pay the Lobola. So that those kind of arrangements can be made.
But the critical thing, the critical thing is the involvement of the community, in this case, the parents. That's the critical thing.
Yes. Within our context, you cannot marry without your parents being involved. You cannot just rush to the home affairs and tell them in Velugosha.
Right. So
it's a taboo.
Right. Sometimes I hear Kulegani, I note that hand, I'm coming to you now. Sometimes I hear, in the Western context that people run to Las Vegas overnight and they go crazy and they get married and they just sign. You are saying in our context that cannot work, that you just go to Home Affairs without no one knowing, and you come back tomorrow, you're married, and then it's like it's accepted. It cannot be accepted in our context. Or can it be accepted, I guess, in a Western context, that you just go to somewhere and someone marries you and it's fine without doing these processes?
It becomes a contextual issue, because that's a practice of another nation or another culture, which is not what we do. But because of change, because of urbanization, people end up copying this kind of practices and doing them. So it would then end up alienating you from the parents and the community, which is both families. Hence, it brings in the issue of in township language, fat and said. They would say that is fat and said.
Right.
Umahlalisane.
Umahlalisane.
Anshatanga niyahlalisana.
Right. Let me involve others here. Kulegani, let me take a live question from Kulegani. Kulegani, you can ask your question.
All right. Nyangezwa, sanibona.
Siyakuzwa baba. Go ahead.
All right. Mfundisi, thank you for the lecture so far. It's been very intriguing. Kodwa-ke, I have just two personal questions regarding ilobola from the Nguni perspective. And secondly, also from the perspective ukuthi in the current stages and the lifestyle that we're currently at, we've got a lot of divorcee, which it seems to be frowned upon within the church. Now, the first question is, with marrying a divorcee, ilobolo, then how is that treated? From mina ezindoda, ngiyolobola umuntu oseka ganiwe ngaphambili and is a divorcee. How is that practice in whichever spectrum she's coming from, Binguni, Botswana, because there's a certain process. And the second one, the same principles that were followed with the first covenant, how is that now perceived as well? Jongoba usuthatha unkosikazi wesibili okanye uthatha indoda or umlisa owesibili. I don't know if mhlawumbe ngizwakele with both of the questions.
How is it perceived by the community or by the African tradition?
By the church, by the church specifically, yes.
How is a person marrying a divorcee perceived by the church? Is that your question?
Yes,
okay,
yes, that's the question.
Okay, Mfundisi watholile, marrying a divorcee versus lobola, a culture to deal kanjani with those complexities. Siyabonga baba.
Yabona khululeka soqala enye indaba ke ndoda. Njengoba ngishilo ukuthi ngesintu indaba yokuthi uyaphuma umshadweni ayikho, ngoba sekwenza isivumelwano ndo. Ayikho leyo, kwabikwa kumvela incane ukuthi naba abantu imideni emibili seyihlangene kwachithwa igazi. Manje kulezi insuku ngoba into seyishintshile ndoda, kuyahlukana kuyashada, kodwa engibonile ukuthi when you marry a divorcee, the same process would be followed. You would be asked to pay lobola. Oh malume nobani bazofuna lobola lakho, lobola. And from the church's point of view, it's a complex measure of marriage and remarriage is something else, which I don't think it's what we're discussing now. But lobola will be paid. Noma ushada umuntu olokhuzana oke waphumula emshadweni.
Okay, but what you're saying, Mfundisi, is actually in the original way that ilobola was designed in African context. Benganayo that side yokuthi abantu bazodivorce. So kuba nzima ukuthi sisho ukuthi-ke, is that what you say?
Yeah, angithi manje sesihlangene izizwe. I mean, we are there's urbanization, there is all these things happening, and we end up being assimilated into different cultures, copying from one another, and we end up mixing different practices. But initially, as Christ said, initially it was not like that. So we need to find a way now on how do we contextualize the issue of lobola and marriage. Hence, I would always encourage that as born-again Christians,
yes,
we need to involve the pastor in what is happening, not at the end, but as from the beginning of the process. With the pastor may not be part of the family negotiations of lobola, but involving the pastor in the process is important. That's why you can have backup of prayer, backup of blessings from a community of Christians. Because on the other hand, there is a involvement of community of non-Christians in the process. So you need to balance the two in that way of bringing in the pastor or a religious leader.
And I think you are dealing a question where the person is saying, shouldn't the church elders be involved from the beginning? So I think you're also answering that when you are saying involve the church from the beginning of the process. But if Mhlampe Ubabumnisi is not covered, I'll give him a chance to ask live a follow-up on that, because I see he asked the question. Mfundisi Mnisi, you have the platform.
All right, no, thank you and greetings. Thanks for the topic.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my question is, like when I got married, my negotiations, I kind of believe it this way, that actually the father is representing the groom, he's representing me, and then I approach my father to elect people who are going to represent me. Like in my case, I spoke with my father. I want my pastor to be there as a delegate of the one who's going to negotiate. And we also took, I actually took two pastors who were my elderly, and then they also accompanied me. But of course, we also took some of the family members, but they were there. That's why I say, can't the family, if you join the church, can they be from the beginning, be part of the negotiation? Because I also understand the marriage to be not just the, why are we dividing the steps? Is it not marriage I don't know how to put it. The church has to be the witness also. It's not that we just coming, the pastors being alone, but the church members, you are joining the family, your family members as the new church, your church members are also the family members, and they have to also witness your marriage. So also they have to be involved, not only just the pastor, but also the church members. And I think maybe just to end this, to say that maybe we need not to be, Christ says is also bringing division, between families. And I think we need to also to be radical in talking about people doing their rituals, to let them know where we stand, and really involving from the beginning, even with the negotiations, the ministers, the elders, that they might also be part of the whole process.
Okay, I think it's clear. Mfundisi, is it necessary that the elders or some of the church members be involved in the negotiations from the start? What is your view on that?
This differs from family to family. I'm surprised that you instructed your father. That is the sign of not respecting your parents. You don't do that in an African setup. You don't instruct parents. So if you instructed your father that your pastor must be there, it's a serious sign of disrespect. Anyway, we'll come to that later. Like I said, this is an oral culture that has been passed from generation to generation. and it has got its own practices. And the practices, once the process begins, certain people, only certain people should be part of the process. Not everybody will be part of the process. The uncle and the aunt, those are the two important people who should be part of the process, of the Lobola process. Others can be brought in, but these two people are key in the Setswana setup. Malume le Rakgadi. Those people are very important. In cases where the family delegation of the boy and the girl feel that they need someone who is skilled in terms of negotiation, then they can bring other people in, but under the leadership of Malume le Rakgadi. So once you bring in a pastor to lead the delegation without the involvement of these two key people, then it becomes something else. And like I said, normally, most of our elders and parents are not born again. Rarely do you find two delegates from both families being born again. It's a rare situation. In most cases, there will be one person who's born again, if there is one. But in 100% of the cases, all people won't be born again Christians. So we don't know, that's a process that we cannot control. But you are bringing in something that I said, that, and I like that, when it is allowed and there is concession that you can bring in someone outside the family and the two delegation parents agree, then it is good. But to go and demand that you're not going to do this process and do this because we're Christians, it is going to create conflict in the whole process.
All right, I think that's
because some of the processes do not bring in ancestral veneration. The issue of ancestral veneration would be towards the end.
all right.
That's where you as a son or you as a daughter have to explain to my parents that I am born again. This is where my stand is. This is what we believe in before the process of Lobola kickstarts. So it is important that we as children or our kids or you as a pastor encourage your members to say once before the process begins, then explain the position of the church and your spiritual position in this matter. Hence, I said, involve the pastor before and during the process so that the family can know where you stand in terms of your faith.
Okay, thank you. George, do you have I see you want to follow up. Do you have a follow-up on that?
No, I think my hand was just still up, but I just want to say that I didn't instruct, like, it's like when you're having 5 uncles, 5 aunties, if you are getting married, there is this auntie that you are close with, that you would like him to handle you know, all have, and then when you sit with your father, and then that's when you deliberate with him that, you know, I would like that Malume to go or that auntie to go to represent me. And my father had to consult all the family side of the mother, the family side of the father, to say, you know, my son wants to do 1, 2, 3. But yeah, of course, they cannot go all of them. And then you have, you communicate it with him. And it's just a deliberation. That's what I was trying to explain. Not instructing, yeah.
Not a problem.
No, thanks for clarifying that, George. Thank you.
Siyabonga. Question here again, Mfundisi, and this I think might speak into the different ways that the different ethnic groups do this. He says, explain where Lobola is paid partially. The money is brought in the beginning of negotiations. The second visit without a full price. Why is it seen as if you are married, not having paid the full price? I think this is amongst the Nguni, if I'm not mistaken, where even if you haven't paid the full price, but he says you are still seen as married. Is that a valid observation? Maybe if you can just clarify that.
I think I missed the question somewhere, but let me say, the issue of Lobola, it's handled differently from community to community. There are those communities where even if you've paid partially, they would allow you to take the girl and allow you to begin life as married people and give you your blessings and say to you, whenever you are able to complete the process, do it later. There are those who say, no, you must complete it now before we allow you to enter into marriage. So it differs from context to context. I know of people who are still married today and they've paid partial lobola and they've raised kids. And one of them, about a few years ago, his child was about to get married. And what he said to me, for this, I have to go and complete my lobola. Otherwise, the lobola of the child is going to go to the girl, to my wife's family. So this is what they do. If you've paid half of your lobola and your child grows up and it's a girl and enters to marriage, that lobola goes to the wife's family as a payment to the outstanding lobola. That's a practice. So it will differ from family to family.
Okay, that is very clear. I see R here. I'm not sure. Oh, is that Mfundisi Hlongwane? Do you have a question? You can ask it, sir. You can go ahead, Revival.
Ngiyabonga Mfundisi. I greet you all, beloved, tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Mzondi. This was a very interesting lecture that we got tonight. I just wanted to ask the question. I have two daughters here. Let me say that as Boo's son want to marry my daughter, and we both agree as the parents that our children can get married without involving Bumalume, Burahadi, and so on. Is that constitute? Can that constitute a proper marriage? I just have a question concerning that in terms of not involving external family members, but just agreeing as the parents of the boy and the girl. Thank you.
That's a great question. And obviously assuming that us being both Christians and understanding that it's not about money, we are saying, okay, you can, my boy can marry your girl. Is that legitimate, Mfundisi?
Yeah, that takes us back to the practice of arranged marriages. So you are arranging a marriage between the two of you, and if it gets blessings from other extended members of the family who supposedly are supposed to be part of this, then it will be considered as marriage. The most important thing is that the element of covenant should come in. That's the most important thing. This is a covenant that is brought before the living God, Yahweh, through Christ, whom we believe him. So if that element is available or present, then I would argue that this is considered marriage before the eyes of God.
The aspect of covenant, as it is practiced maybe through a pastor, is that how maybe it might be in this case, where there's exchange of vows? Is that what you mean? Where there's an exchange of vows and rings and all of that?
Do you want me to respond?
Yes, I'm asking, when you say as long as the element of covenant is present, I'm saying in this case, how would that look like? Are you saying maybe it will just be a pastor, maybe doing the bargaining, those things, the vows and the promises between the two?
Who has prescribed vows for marriage? That is where we must first begin. Who has said when we marry, you must make vows?
Hey, I
think we should be careful. Vows are an imposed system. In terms of the African worldview, marriage becomes valid and presented as a covenant once it is presented to the divine. There are no vows there.
So,
And if a vow can be made in the Setswana culture where I have some kind of information, a stone is used to show that you are entering into an indissoluble covenant. A stone would be used, a reed would be used to show that kind of commitment and some kind of vow. So a Western system would say, let's make a vow, you are part of my body, you are all that. That is imposed on us. And the Christian community has embraced that because it came with missionary endeavor. But it's not a prerequisite before God.
so then, Mfundisi, athi kungena emlomeni wokuxolisa. So now, when you are saying that divine must be included in our way of the two families, and the divine must be included, it's obviously not going to involve vows, that divine. How is a pastor then, should I say, consummating, or how is the pastor included to make sure that the covenant is then sort of said in that kind of a ceremony? How does it look like then for a covenant, for the covenant to, because you are saying the covenant is important. So now we are obviously not invoking ancestors, and a pastor is there. So if they don't say vows, what does a pastor do to say that this is a covenant?
The issue of vows is a prescription of the Marriage Act. It's not a prescription of the Judeo-Christian belief.
Okay.
It's prescribed in the Marriage Act of 1965. You've got to make this vow so that your marriage is considered legal and registered.
Okay.
So you can marry people without making those vows. You can bless them without those vows. And there is a theology before that a theology that was developed before the Marriage Act, that the church became involved and began to prescribe vows that must be made for marriage. So the church has also, over the years, prescribed these vows, and the Marriage Act and the legal system adopted them as a framework to recognize that if you've made these vows, you are now considered married. So there's a church-state relationship and dynamic there.
Right.
But if we want to learn from the Judeo-Christian perspective before theologizing it into vows and all those things, then we need to say the most important thing there in the vows is this is a covenant that you should not break. That's the most important thing. Hence, if you look into vows which are said, they are pointing towards a covenant being entered into. And the ring being part of that, you're entering into a covenant in a Western way.
But I'm saying, how do you do that without vows? How do you then show that the covenant has been made without doing vows?
Don't you bless people and pray for them? You can do it that way.
So you would pray for them because a covenant, as I understand it, it's a promise between two parties, and I'm assuming the until death do us part is also a biblical thing where obviously a man and a woman must not divorce until death. So if you are praying without necessarily invoking that aspect of the longevity of the covenant, how is it still a covenant if it's just a prayer without saying until death?
Remember, it is assumed that we are not talking of a Western approach. We're talking of an African Ubuntu approach. It is assumed that this is a community event.
Yes.
So you're bringing the community of the two families and the community of the church. So these are two communities.
Right.
So in the community of a church, you can bless the couple, and before blessing them, and find out as a pastor that they have agreed to enter into a marriage covenant and to stay as husband and wife committed to each other, without bringing in the issues of vows, which I say are later were later conceptualized by theologians, and the law brought them as a prescription.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Mfundisi. Since you went there, you can also just say, put up your hand if you have a question. You can ask it. If there's an aspect that you feel like he did not address in this topic, please feel free to put up your hand and ask. So Mfundisi, since you went there, we might as well go there to the aspect of then these so-called white weddings. Let's even double click on that. So you're saying that the issue then of having the so-called white wedding is actually not necessary at all for a marriage to be recognized as a marriage.
Yeah, look, you say white wedding, and white wedding assumes Western culture.
Right.
So it has been imposed on us. Remember, we are from a colonized apartheid era where everything that is done not in a Western way is demonized and seen as evil. So if you marry in that way, then you are recognized as having been married properly.
Yes.
Hence, we end up having a white wedding on Saturday and a traditional wedding on Sunday. So that you balance the two to show people that white wedding.
Mm.
And then it will be accepted, but it's a product of colonialism and apartheid, that we belittle our processes and uphold only Western processes and see them as civilized and ours as uncivilized. And today you find people getting married without a wedding gown, but dressed in other fashions and styles. It is possible. It's no longer a big deal.
Thank you.
You don't have to have a white gown and a suit, but you can be dressed in a formal way or semi-formal way to get married, and present and have the pastor preside over that. And the issue of vows then maybe engaged in between the pastor and the couple. And it is important, like I said, to have the pastor involved in the whole process, so that by the time there is a service, then there is understanding between the pastor and the couple and the families as well, what is happening.
Thank you, sir. Maybe as we then quickly drawing to a close, Mfundisi, what do you say is the future of this practice amongst us? As you are surveying, as you are a pastor, you are a theologian, you are an academic, what are you seeing as the future of this practice? Do you see there's something that will continue even as people get more westernized and more as we live in a global village? Do you see this continuing, or would you see a situation where we will not need this practice anymore? You feel like it's going to become extinct in the future, or it's going to become more important?
Normally, as theologians, we like to say religion will always be part of us. No matter how we become civilized, no matter how we become modernized or urbanized, religion will always be part of us. And with the African aspect of Ubuntu, and which does not dichotomize between the metaphysical and the physical, right, we'll always have this practice. It's a matter of how do we implement it. It will always be there, because it brings in the element of the divine into a marriage, and that element is a covenant between the two who are getting married and the two families. It has been commercialized, yes, but I think as time goes on, we'll have to do away with certain elements, do away with rings, do away with expensive gowns, do away with a lot of food, do away with all those things.
Okay.
Because you have entered into a marriage covenant You are now buying rings, which is a sign of a Western sign of a covenant. So you are showing two covenants. You are observing two covenants.
Hey.
And we want to run with the Western covenant and do away with the African covenant. Why are we ashamed with the African covenant and want to embrace the Western covenant?
Come on now for this.
Because you've got something on your fingers, then you think it's civilized.
All right. Let me
So
take
do away with Western culture of a ring, because you are not married because you have a ring on your finger. You are married because you've entered a covenant.
Yes, sir. Powerful.
And it has got a divine blessing on it.
Let me take a question from Umpo Mfuke. There's a hand there. You can ask your questions, Umpo.
Greetings, everyone.
Greetings,
Thanks
sir.
so much, Pastor. I just have two questions. One question is this: there's a part in the process of getting married. La Umfundisi mentioned that.
I can't hear you. Can you raise your voice, please?
Oh, okay. I'm just saying that there's a part you mentioned, Umfundisi, that says we as the bride and groom are not involved, which is the process of Lobola. So my question lies there, Uti, because most of our families, like you mentioned, are not born again Christians. So are we now, as the Christians, saying we are turning a blind eye on the practices of ancestral practices during Lobola, so that when it's done, we invite Umfundisi, to bless umshado wethu? Is that how we view it? That's one question I have. And then the other question, my second one, is in Ephesians 5:31. Where Christ marries the church, an illustration is made of that. Do we see Christ's blood in that process as the blood of covenant that you also mentioned about in the Lobola process, Yom Shatu? That's just the two questions I have. And thanks so much for the much information we've gotten today.
Uti, your second question from Ephesians 5, do you see Christ's blood as the
Okay. Christ is illustrated as marrying the church in Ephesians chapter 5, from verses 31. I've just on the chat. My question is Christ's blood seen as the covenant blood in terms of, remember when you in the process of getting married, gulobola.
Yes.
That's the covenant that says two families are brought together. Is Christ's blood the same symbol here, saying marrying us, we are becoming one? Yes, that's
okay.
That's
Yes, Fundis.
Okay.
The issue.
Sorry, Fundis. Oppo CPH 187. Please mute yourself. Okay. Fundis.
1 Corinthians chapter 7 brings in marriage within the followers of Christ in the church of Corinth. And there is nowhere where the issue of lobola or rings of cultural practices are mentioned. So Paul says, if you want to get married and you think it's right, get married then. If you don't want to get married, then that's okay, continue with that. But don't separate. If you and your wife or husband are one believer, the other not believer. If you agree to stay together, stay together. But if you agree to separate, do separate. So Paul addresses marriage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 without giving prescriptions of cultural practices. So the blood of Christ is not applied in that marriage context. So blood is applied in the context of forgiveness of sins, not sealing a marriage.
That's helpful.
Hence, I'm saying, if we want to bring the divine aspect into our marriage, assuming that it has been brought by the Lobola process, and we don't want to subscribe to the ancestral veneration aspect of it, this is where the pastor becomes important. to undo that, to present this marriage to God, not to the ancestors, to ancestral veneration. I think this is where I want to make an emphasis. The church comes in there, the pastor comes in there to undo what was done by the families who have presented this marriage to the ancestors. I hope that becomes clear.
Yes. No, you are clear for this. So what is then your advice to Christians who during the negotiation they find, because there's often people that are not Christians that, and I've also experienced this personally, where they insist that certain practices must be done, where things must be sacrificed to ancestors. How should Christians respond during those times where they are now coerced to be part of the ceremonies?
This is why I said that the relationship between the pastor and the family is important. So that before the process, the family is made aware of the stand of the tithe. Remember, the child, or be the boy or the girl, is a member of the church. So explaining the standpoint on certain issues is important to the family. So by the time they engage into the process, they know that the girl or the boy does not subscribe to this kind of practices. We cannot stop them from doing them, but make them aware that we are not part of that, we don't subscribe to them. They will do them anyway because we are not there. And we don't control the process. It becomes easier when a delegation is sent, comprises of members of the church who the families are allowed to be part of. Then you are able to influence the process. But you might find that on the other side, that delegation has no one who is born again. So how do you also do these things? So it ends up creating some kind of conflict. So that's why we need to be as wise as serpents and humble as doves to handle this thing. It's a complex issue.
Thank you for this. What practical ways can we help believers who are then wanting to, obviously, who have to follow this process, but sometimes financially there's issues, and as it has been said, there might be issues with sometimes families where even someone here made a comment about if someone lives in an apartment, or maybe someone didn't have a father, or someone maybe doesn't have the money.
Can you raise your voice? I can't hear you.
I'm saying, practically, how can the church intervene, in terms of helping someone or people who are then have to go through this process, but because we live in a very, difficult world, there's challenges where someone here is saying maybe if somebody lives in an apartment, or maybe someone doesn't have enough finances to be able to pay, how can the church be helpful practically?
Yeah, let's say we are living in two communities: the community of the relatives and the society where you are, and the community of a church. So we move between these two communities, and in these two communities there are values and beliefs which are conflicting. So it is important that as you move between these two communities, you begin to explain, like Peter says, be able to explain your faith in a proper way to others who ask you questions about it. So be able to answer questions and explain your faith or your belief to other people. And hence I would always say, do not begin to a process of wanting to get married if you don't have enough money. Now we talk of money to get married, because that's one thing that's one hurdle that you have to go through, unfortunately. And today it has become expensive to pay lobola. It has become astronomically expensive. And that's where prayer comes into play, that pray about it. Pray that God should touch the girl's family or the boy's family, so that the negotiation process should not be that difficult. God does perform miracles in these processes. It's a matter of, are we allowing God to be part of the process? Or do you want to come at the end when the process is concluded? So it is important when we bring God into the process before the process begins. As the scripture says, present all your cares. It says, cast all your cares unto him because he cares. So it's a serious thing that you want to engage in. You don't have money, you live in an apartment, put it into prayer and ask God for intervention.
Thank you for this. I also heard about having a fund where maybe even, I don't know what your thoughts on that, where as a church, you actually have a fund where people give into that, so that, as obviously, as wisdom comes through, you are able to, even as a church, help people who are not able to pay. I don't know if that violates the tradition, but as a church, having a financial fund where you help some people who might not be able to afford. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, well, we can do that, but remember that nowadays you have women who help men to pay the lobola.
That's true. That is true.
It happens. So we can agree to get married, and I know that you can't afford it. Then I can give you money, and you bring it back as lobola to my family. I mean, that's some other wisdom that can be done.
Right.
But it should not be a public practice, because once that is sin, then you will be seen as someone who is irresponsible as a man. Because lobola is one of the signs that you can lead a family, you can provide.
Right.
So if you sishaya sishukunikeza imali lapha ephuma enkonzo sithi hamba uyoshada, andoda siyakumosha.
Hey.
We can help you. I've been in a situation where I helped and contributed, but you've got to do something. Do something, and we can help you. And in other cases, uncles and aunts will say, "Mtanam, if you're able, no longer keep nje ibhoko nje lodwa thina sofaka inkomo."
Right.
And do something that shows that you are a man. You are not you're a man. You are grown up. Take responsibility. It's not about manhood. It's about maturity.
Yes, sir.
So show signs of maturity. So lobola does not make you to dominate a woman or a wife. No, it's a sign of maturity that you are now a responsible person.
Thank you.
And you can provide for a family.
Very, very helpful. That's why we have, Paul talks about having our own poets and elders, and you are giving wisdom to some of these things. Question here, in the event where parents or families fail to reach an agreement, I think this is an important question. Can a couple still continue to get married the legal route, or get blessed by a pastor and be seen as married before the eyes of God? Very critical question. It happens sometimes that maybe parents, they don't agree to the marriage because of whatever reason. Can the two still continue to get married and be seen, and that can be legitimate in the eyes of God? Thanks for that question.
Yeah, this one, this is a hot one. I don't wish this should happen. It's a worst case scenario. I know of a scene where the marriage is put on hold. The process of lobola has been completed, but the marriage feast is kept on hold because there was a conflict between the makoti and the in-laws. So they said, this is not going to go ahead. And there's nothing you can do about it. So there are times when these things crop up, where there are funny things happening, and there are tensions, there are conflicts, and What do you do? Pray about the situation and ask God to intervene, because some of these things will crop up. But I would not encourage you to do a marriage covenant and go into the home affairs without the involvement of your parents on both sides. I would say rather wait, and I would not encourage pastors to do it. Rather wait, bring in the family. Yes, they might not all come on board, but there might be members of the family who can be part of that. Remember, you need blessings of your parents. Whether they're born again or not, you need their blessings. You need that cover, and they don't have to be born again to give that cover and blessing.
Thank you. That's very clear. I think that was a very important question. Sylvester, I think that question was answered. Is it possible that two people can agree to be married without lobola as long as the family agrees? I think Mfundisi answered that question because the critical component is the family and the community, being in agreement with that. Do you want to add to that, Mfundisi? Is it possible that two can agree to be married without lobola as long as the families agree?
Yes, it is possible, but remember, as I said, there are dynamics. Marriage is a covenant between two people. It's a covenant. It's not a legal contract. And in the African context, it begins with the process of lobola. In the Western context, it has its own process, and it also involves a ring to show that there is a covenant. So the issue of covenant is important in marriage. Have you seen people and said ring? Cohabitation does not involve all those things because it does not emphasize the issue of covenant. Umahlalisana ndoda akunayo lapho uyathatha uyahlala nomuntu umshiye uthatha omunye uyahlalisana. That's why kodwa uyahlalisana awushadanga. So let's avoid being perceived as and let's be part of what God sees as a covenant. God promotes a covenant, and we've seen it from the Old Testament. This should be a covenant, not umaslalisa. Not
Thank
because you want to buy a house and then you agreed you want to sign a joint contract, then ultimately you because you've got a joint loan or a joint bond. No, that's not the case.
Thank you, Mfundisi. We've got 2 minutes left, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mzondi. People do not see your he's got a nice background, but he's sitting outside the cold because there was no electricity where he was. So thank you so much for braving the cold and just continuing to help us and answer questions like this. I'm going to just read the script and hand over to Ubafana. Genesis 2:24. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Thank you so much. This was so helpful, and I think we are much more wiser than we were 2 hours ago when we started. Pastor Bafana, you can go ahead, and then we will close. If anyone still has questions, we will then stay. I see Francina has a question, and Umpo. Let us just say some final announcements so we honor the time. We said 8:15, and then afterwards we'll pray, and then we'll continue to take some more questions for those who have more questions, because we know with Iksasa, we are not going to work. So yeah, Bafana.
Thank you very much, Mfundisi and Sibu. Hey, mariring yami Mfundisi ngiyayithanda ngizoyigqoka. It identifies.
And the shoot of my camera.
Yes, you can.
Can I switch off my camera?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Thanks, Babulo. So thanks, Baba Mzondi. Baba Mzondi has this book. I don't know whether you can see it. Ubuntu Pentecostal, where he come from. He writes the exciting book with a lot of information, particularly knowing your roots and research. It's 200. You can get it now. They have an updated one, and it's on what we call ebooks. Ebooks. It's got this book, and another one about the two group of Christians, which is called Article Found in the Large House. It's got also this book. It speaks about the book that demonstrates that there are two groups of Christian leaders. They want to explore Christian leadership through two groups and indicate Christian leader in the church and in the marketplace. It's got also this book. There's another one that's called Living in the Act Way. Living in the Act Way. Act is an acronym of demonstrating God's hand in your life and in family. All these books are available. The Academy of Theology has them. They took them so that they can, if you want them, you can inbox us on our Facebook page, and we will supply your book. We won't charge you postage. We'll try to reach you where you are, except you are in Cape Town, then we'll charge you postage. Another thing that we will do, we will post this on YouTube as soon as it's available. Keep on looking on YouTube. Go and like our page. It's called the Academy of Theology, or the ATHEO, the Academy of Theology. And go to our Facebook page. Also like the page and also follow us there. And you'll also see it when it's up, maybe from next week. We will be having another webinar soon. We will inform you. Thank you very much for all of you for joining. We wish you all the best, and you take tomorrow. If you still have questions, please remain. Maybe Mzondi will take some 15 or 20 minutes so that we honor time for those who are who get everything right. Ngathi ngamshayela izandla Mzondi ngokuphakamisa bese siyavala sibuzovala bese ke siyachubeka nabachubekayo.
Sicela simshayeleni izandla simbonge uDr. Mzondi. He's a doctor. He's so humble, this man. We've been at his house. Umuntu osahlala elokishini, even though he doesn't, he really lives the Ubuntu values. We love him, and these are such people that we need to treasure in our community. We don't need always to go to Western people to explain our context. We do ourselves have people that can do it very well. So let's honor these men. Let us respect them in our community, because they are really, really our fathers in the faith. Just to say that our next webinar will also be in July. We're going to be dealing with lessons that we can learn from missionaries' failures and success in bringing the gospel to South Africa. Another doctor will be addressing us, Dr. Resani, a historical theologian. Not many of you know that we do have historical theologians here in South Africa. It's not just people from America. And so he's going to be telling us about lessons we can learn from missionary failures and successes when they brought the gospel. He wrote a book about the South African experience in terms of church history. So you don't want to miss that. We are going to be announcing the date in July. Okay, I'm going to pray. And then afterwards, those who still have, I'm going to put some more questions to him. And those who want to go can go. Those who still want to continue to be around can be around. Let us pray. Lord, I just want to thank you so much for these sessions. What an eye-opening session. Modimo Raolebo, because your word is clear. Your word it speaks to so many issues in life. It even speaks to our experiences as Africans. We find ourselves there. You had us in mind when you wrote this Bible. Our cultures and our practices were not demonic to you. Father, you have your standard of the word, but at the same time, you are also helping us as Africans to know how we fit into this narrative. And so help us. There's so many situations, so many scenarios in this that we need help with in this Lobola situation. So many issues that we face when we go through this as Africans. Help us to do it well as Christians. Help us to be biblical and to also honor you in whatever that we are doing. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.